This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I am talking with a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist named Nick Longrich, and I discovered him on a YouTube video in a debate that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But coming up now, we're going to talk about Nick's career and how he got into his field. And I am talking with Nick Longrich. Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed, Nick. And as I mentioned, I had in a debate that I'll discuss a little bit later. But in looking up your history, you seem to have been well in Alaska. It seems spent some time in Canada. Now you're over in England. Were you the typical boy that had? I know when I was growing up, you were a little bit younger. There was the How, Why, and Wonder books of dinosaurs and stuff. Were you just enraptured by the big lizards? Or?
I mean, I did have a lot of those books, sure. I don't know that my interest in them was excessive, for the age. It was something I sort of maybe kind of, I don't know if it maybe kind of grew out of a bit and then kind of grew back into, if that makes any sense. And I've always been really interested in nature. I grew up doing tide pooling in front of my family's house in Alaska, going down and flipping over rocks. I'd hunt for bugs. I'd collect plants up in the alpine, and dinosaurs were just kind of one more aspect of that. And then I got really interested in evolution in high school, actually, reading books about evolution, reading books about paleontology. And the thing that really appealed to me about dinosaurs is that you're looking at evolution on long time scales. So you see things that happen over periods of a million years, 10 million years, 100 million years that you couldn't really infer from looking at modern ecosystems or looking at what we have today. You can't really understand how did birds evolve flight or where did birds come from just by looking at modern birds. So that was sort of the interest in fossils for me.
And what part of Alaska were you? Were you along the coast, along British Columbia, or up near the Arctic Circle, or what?
It's in the Gulf of Alaska on an island called Kodiak Island, and I grew up
Oh,
in the town of Kodiak. It's got about 10,000 people there. There's no roads to the island. You have to either fly on or off, or take a ferry to get there. And it was a good place to grow up.
are there glaciers there? Because I know as a with dinosaurs, but with glaciers and Louis Agassiz and the study of glaciers, is there a big glacier on the island or not?
I think there's a little glacier like tucked way up in the mountains where you can't really see it. I've never been there, and I've done a fair amount of hiking up there. So it's there's not a lot of glaciers. I mean, it's probably not what people would think of when they think of Alaska. It's probably what people would think of if they think of British Columbia. Say it's very wet, it's very rainy, it's very cool. The summers aren't very pleasant. You know, it's that kind of an Alaska. It's a marine Alaska.
Yeah.
So no glaciers, I'm afraid.
So once you got to say be a teen, did you always was being working with dinosaurs or in archaeology, paleontology? Were you already fixed on that, or was that something that came later to you?
Uh, it was something I really kind of got into in high school. I started reading books about them. I started reading some of Stephen Jay Gould's books on evolution and paleontology. I started reading about debates about the extinction of dinosaurs and the origins of birds. And I think there was what was it? Gregory S. Paul's Predatory Dinosaurs of the World really excited me.
Mm.
I think part of it was the artistic aspect of it. I've always been an artist. I enjoy drawing.
Ah,
And a lot of these paleontologists incorporated a lot of artwork into what they did. And that was something about it that sort of excited me. Uh, Bob Bakker's book, Dinosaur Heresies, really kind of got me fired up. And I liked how he had kind of provocative, interesting ideas. And so there was kind of, it's partly dinosaurs, it was partly a certain flavor of paleontology that was going on at that time. I thought, it was a very, creative field. A lot of things were happening, a lot of debates were going on, and it just seemed like an exciting thing for that reason. And there's just kind of a bit of a romance and mystery to it. These dinosaurs out in the field. I first went to a paleontological conference, I think, right after my senior year of high school, and it was. I think in some ways it was one of the biggest letdowns of my life. Uh,
in
I
what in what way was it? Just a lot of people, just gabbing in techno speak or dino
no,
speak?
I
Or
like that part. I
yeah,
like that part. I liked some of the people were great. I I got into a big argument with a very prominent paleontologist about the end Cretaceous mass extinction, and but what really kind of struck me was that I was out in the field and we were looking for dinosaur bones, and we came across one, and it was this small black cylinder, this kind of tapered at either ends like an elongate spool, and it was the caudal vertebra of a diplodocid dinosaur, like either a brontosaurus or a diplodocus or something.
Yeah.
And Jack McIntosh, who is the world expert on sauropods, looks at these. He's like, "Oh wow, that's fantastic! I've never seen anything that good in the field before." And I'm like, "That's it." And it just seemed like so underwhelming. And I'd been picturing like these giant articulated skeletons, and I was looking at like,
Yeah.
"Wow, this is really hard," and like, there's not much out here to find. And like, it just seemed to, I don't know. I don't know what I was thinking. I guess I was thinking like, lots of big skeletons like you see in the museum in New York.
Yeah.
And I thought it'd be all about you're working on that type of thing all the time, and you just those things are jumping out of the ground, and it just seems so underwhelming. I just kind of assumed right then and there that I really liked paleontology, but I didn't think I could ever be a paleontologist if that's what I had to go on, and I just thought it would just be. So yeah, I don't know. It wasn't until I got into college and started going into museums and looking at fossils and reading papers about it and developing my own ideas, I realized it was something I wanted to do.
Yeah, I actually, you'd mentioned Gregory Paul. I actually did a written interview with Gregory Paul a few years ago, which you can find on my website if you ever have a chance to look at it.
Okay.
It's quite interesting. After the initial interest, did you also like go back and read on the history of things? Because I know as a kid, I would read, you know, I wasn't really like a geeky nerd kid. I grew up in New York. I wasn't out in the wilderness like you, but I remember reading Lyell's Principles of Geology, and then
Yeah.
the Marsh and Cope Bone Wars, reading about
Yeah.
that, and then about Wilberforce and Huxley debate.
I, I read Origin of Species, and Darwin as a writer and a thinker I really admire a lot. As a scientist and a person, I think he's somebody of incredible insight, and I think there's also a compassion to him that comes through in his writing. So he was somebody I read, and for the most part back then, I wasn't so much interested in the history. I was interested in the new things that seemed to be happening, new debates, new fossils. And it's kind of over time I've developed an appreciation for where everything comes from, and what it must have been like to develop the science back when you were Marsh or Cope, say, and
Yeah.
what Marsh did that was extraordinary, not all that extraordinarily good. How things progress in the history of science. It's something I think back then you're young, you're excited with new things and the idea, and how the guys did things in the olden days seemed a lot less interesting to me, and over time my appreciation and going through and reading like some of these guys, there's uh, guys like Gilmore, who's maybe not a famous name these days, but he just did a lot of really, really good descriptive work. And a lot of times, if you want a paper on, say, a Lamosaurus, Gilmore's is still some of the best stuff out there. And he did a lot of work, helping to find things, describe things. So I've come to appreciate, uh, who's the guy at Princeton, Jepson, who did a lot of the field work finding these mammal localities. So there's a lot of kind of think like sort of unsung heroes if you start going back and reading papers and you start realizing like, wow, this guy did some really important stuff. And so I feel like as my career has progressed, I've developed a deeper understanding of an appreciation for the history that, when you're young, you don't appreciate that stuff quite as much.
Yeah, we'll get into a little bit. You mentioned getting into an argument, and one of the things that when I first discovered your video, is it did put me in mind of the Wilberforce Huxley type of debate from years ago, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But
Okay.
why don't we end this segment, and when we get back, we'll talk a little bit more before we get into that. We mentioned before we started about you seem to be centered a bit on the ceratopsians, and most people who grow up, they're amongst the groups of dinosaurs that are most interesting to look at. So why don't we
Yeah.
take a break, and when we get back, we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, Nick, I had mentioned that you seem to, from what I've looked online in the last few years, had a lot of involvement with the ceratopsians. And for those who may not be familiar, that's the Triceratops, that's the great horned dinosaurs, the Styracosaurus, and the old famous night painting with T-Rex going at Triceratops. Uh, is that a focus of yours, or the Ceratopsian lineage, or is it just something that over the last 2 or 3 years you've just sort of has come about?
Well, it was just sort of something I stumbled into. It wasn't really something I planned on, and then I kind of, once I got into it, it was kind of easy to keep going. I ran across this. I just kind of tried to familiarize myself with all the dinosaurs in the dinosaur park formation, which is I was going through there and trying to find new things. And I was mostly interested in the theropod dinosaurs at the time, but I was just kind of interested in the general problem of how many species were there and how do they change through the formation. And so I started familiarizing myself with other things out there. And I was in the basement of the American Museum of Natural History, and I ran across this frill fragment down there. And this frill, and I looked at it, I wonder what that is. I was just sort of curious about it. And I thought, it kind of looks like a Chasmosaurus, but it's not right for Chasmosaurus. And kind of looks a bit like a Pentaceratops, I thought, but it's not right for a Pentaceratops either. And then I realized it was, quite possibly something new. And so I started going through the Tyrrell Museum collections and found more and more specimens of this new thing, which ended up becoming Mojoceratops. And wrote up that paper. And in the process of writing up that paper, I started running across additional things that I didn't know what to do with, and so more new species. So it was just sort of, it wasn't necessarily a grand plan so much as one thing leads to another.
Yeah. Now, have there been other lineages of dinosaurs? I noticed too that you had found what looked like a small raptor kind of dinosaur recently. I saw something. Tell me about that.
Yeah, there's Hesperonychus, and there's another one which not really a raptor, but Albertonicus. And Hesperonychus is a really cool animal, and I started going through the Tyrrell Museum collections and running across these little claws, little talons, and they're the sickle claw. There's a blade-like retractable claw on the second toe in the Dromaeosaurs, the raptors, things like Velociraptor and Deinonychus.
Yeah.
But these are really tiny, and they're small enough that they just about fit on a quarter, American or Canadian, as the case may be. These are Canadian specimens, and everyone had always assumed these things are like either juveniles of a big raptor like Sternthalistes, or they're birds. And I looked at them, and I learned talking to paleontologists like Phil Curry that you could identify whether a dinosaur was mature or a juvenile based on the bone texture. As the adult dinosaurs have a highly finished, kind of glossy, almost ceramic-like texture to the bone. It's very, very dense and smooth, and the juveniles have very porous bone. And these little claws had a really dense bone texture. And I looked at them, I said, these look like the adult of a very small raptor. And they'd been finding similar things over in China for a long time, and I figured, well, why can't we have them here? And so I sort of launched off into this multi-year quest to find more of these things, and eventually hit on this little piece of a pelvis that was able to prove that, yeah, we have these tiny raptors, and they're related to these Chinese four-winged raptors. So, I mean, it was a really fun discovery, but, the fossils are so rare that it just sort of ended right there. The ceratopsians, they're really abundant. So, after the first one, there's lots of additional papers. And yeah.
Now you mentioned a couple of times, sort of scrounging through collections of bones. Are you basically then more of a theorist rather than a field guy, or?
Well, I think a theorist would mean I don't actually look at data. I look at raw data. I look at the fossils, but I spend most of my time looking at the fossils in the museums rather than collections. And I like field work. I've spent, long field seasons out in Dinosaur Provincial Park. I was, lucky enough to get to the Gobi Desert and with Phil Curry and look for dinosaurs out there. I've been to the field in New Mexico, in other places, and it's just never been something I've really excelled at. And I don't think I'm a bad field paleontologist. I've never been lucky enough, though, to be in the type of place where there's just bones of new things left, right, and center coming out of the ground. And so it's just been kind of a bit of a conscious decision that, like, I could go spend weeks and weeks and weeks running around the field trying to find things, and I've done that, and okay, I've got a Brachylophosaurus, but we have a bunch of those, and we have some pretty nice ones actually. Do we need another? It was just a lot more productive to spend that week going through museum collections, processing what other people had already found. So I like field work a lot. It's a lot of fun. I have a huge amount of respect for the people who do it, but just career-wise, it's made a lot more sense to focus on analyzing what we've already got.
Yeah. Now, just to segue, you had mentioned a bone texture, and that actually, in the initial video that made me aware of your career,
Yeah.
there was this particularly devastating moment. You, just to set the scene, you were debating for about an hour or so with a well-known paleontologist in America, Jack Horner, and Horner has been for the last decades, along with Bob Bacher, probably sort of the twin titans of PBS idea of the paleontologist. And the basic debate was whether Torosaurus and Triceratops were juvenile and adult versions of the same dinosaur or not. And when you were debating with Horner, basically he promised to have a lot of evidence here or there, and he was in a lot of ways evasive. And you had one particularly devastating moment that even if someone was going to, in my opinion, say that it was a draw, then I thought you were clearly winning the debate. But you had a photograph of like an almost oval shaped bone, and you had a line in the middle of it. On the upper half, it was well, I think on one half it was sort of Swiss cheesy looking. The other half was dense, and you sort of set stringing it along, and and then you removed the line and showed it was the same bone, and there was like an audible gasp in the audience, and it was just one of those moments that just as someone who enjoys dialectic and debate, I was like, it's over. I mean, and I don't mean to harp on the point, but it was just a terrific moment, because when I watch on YouTube science debates, it's always Richard Dawkins beating up some idiot not religious people, where this was
Yeah.
actually real science, and it's something that
Yeah.
a young person should actually see. So anyway, if you want to just talk a little bit about that debate and how they came about, and what the general argument between the Hornerites and people like you were.
Yeah. So Jack Horner and his colleagues have been promoting the idea that some of the dinosaurs out there that we identify as separate species are actually just either adults or juveniles of known species. And this is definitely something that does happen. Sometimes you dig up the adult, you dig up the juvenile, and they can look really, really different. And you just go, different species. Uh, Nanotyrannus is probably a case of that. It's not 100% sure, but there's no compelling evidence that Nanotyrannus is anything other than juvenile T Rex. It appears to be juvenile. It looks a lot like a T Rex. It's related to it. Um, Other examples, I think some of the Pachycephalosaurs, I would say that probably Dracorex is probably a juvenile or a female of Stygimoloch, that Pachycephalosaur homalocephali, which is sometimes considered to be among the most primitive pachycephalosaurs, I think is either a juvenile or a female of Prenocephaly. So definitely this happens. I don't think though that this is the case in Triceratops and Torosaurus. And so the reasons being is that we don't really have, in my opinion, any compelling evidence for intermediate forms between the two. And nobody's been able to show that Torosaurus that or rather, we do have evidence for immature Torosauruses. And
Yeah.
so if Torosaurus is just a grown-up Triceratops, there shouldn't be any juveniles of it. There should be only adults, and what we found is some juveniles. And so Jack had been pushing this idea, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to kind of push back on it a bit. And I think partly it was just I kind of didn't like the idea, and I kind of wanted to put a critique of it out there a bit. I think and also at the time I was hunting for a permanent academic job, and I didn't figure that picking a fight could. I figured it couldn't hurt my career, so that was maybe a bit of a cynical ploy there. But it is what it is, I guess. Uh, so yeah, I don't know. Again, I feel that this is definitely something that happens, but in this particular case, it's not something that's borne out by the facts. We need to find things that are intermediate between Triceratops and Torosaurus, and we have it. And there's like a couple hundred skulls out there. I think if it existed, we'd have it by now.
Yeah,
So
and let me just, as a layman and someone who grew up looking at dinosaur books, and again, I'm a layman. I'll defer to experts here or there, but when an argument is laid out kind of clearly, and it sort of jives with you, some things sort of click. And there were three things in the debate that, for me, just as a layman, you seem to sort of lay out as well. And the one is that adult Triceratops were as big as Torosaurs. Torosaurs may have had a longer neck frill, but they were not generally noticeably larger on average than Triceratops. The second was
Yeah.
the nose horn of the
Yeah.
Triceratops, and the third one was that the Triceratops frill is shorter and has a pronounced turn upward. And I
Yeah.
don't know of how that would flatten out through time to be the more flattened, and so just as a layman, it and I'm not a dinosaur expert. I'm not
Yeah.
a scientist, but that just seems to me be something that if you have Pentaceratops, there's the two little horns that come down
Yeah.
by the jowls, and you could say, well, is that just an adult Triceratops? But have any Triceratops even got So these were
Yeah.
just those kinds of things that, as a layman, and if it's obvious to me, it would seem to. I don't know. Maybe I was predisposed, but were those obvious things to you as well that you think you that you know?
It's a bit tricky. I mean, size can be a bit tricky in the sense that sometimes you can have an animal that hits basically adult size, and then some weird things start happening to the skull. So, I mean, Pachycephalosaurus seem to do that. They kind of reach full size and then go through kind of some additional maturation. A deer gets pretty large and then it grows antlers. So the size thing isn't necessarily fatal, I think, to the argument. But there are things that are really difficult. And, the reason for that name, Triceratops, that famous long nose horn that's only found in one of the two species of Triceratops, well, you never see that in Torosaurus. So it would have to shorten the nose horn. And that's an important thing there. And the fact that there are these two species of Triceratops, one has a long nose horn and one has a short nose horn. But Torosaurus doesn't do that. It only has a short nose horn. That's really strong evidence, I think, that it's not. If it was just a Triceratops, it should have both morphs. It should have the long horn and the short horn, and it doesn't. And the frill shape is a big thing. The curvature is important. And something that seems like it would be a kind of minor little detail, but it's not, is the number of little scallops on the back of the frill. Each of those is a bone associated with a scale. And so it basically tells you they have different numbers of scales on the back of their frill. And that might seem trivial, but the number of scales is fixed in the embryo. You hatch out with as many scales as you're going to have. You don't make more over time. So that's actually, you can fuse bones together and things like that, but scale number is something that's pretty inflexible. The fact that they have different numbers of scales on their frills really tells you a lot. And that's actually how people tell modern lizards and snakes apart. They'll count the number of scales on the lips or something, or the number of scales on the back of the head, and say, they have a different scale count, different species. It works for them and it works for dinosaurs.
Yeah, and also for people who are more lay than I, you know, people often associate Triceratops and ceratopsians with rhinoceroses, but the
Yeah.
difference is a rhinoceros's horn is not made of bone, and I could conceive of some kind of mechanism at maturation, perhaps retaking back the fibrous. Whatever the keratin or whatever makes a rhino horn, but it would seem to me, as far as I know, again as a layman, there's just no mechanism that would do that in bone. Maybe I'm wrong.
So there is actually potentially a mechanism for that.
Yeah.
Curiously enough, is there is there when we do see this, and in dinosaurs like Centrosaurus, they start out with short horns over the brow, and as they get older, they lose that.
Uh-huh.
But we can also see how that happens. They start developing these great big pits and holes, and the horns turn all like kind of Swiss cheese or something. Uh, to get rid of that bone, you have to resorb it, and that leaves a
Yeah.
trace. So you can see that it could happen, but if it does happen, you're going to see it. And what would happen is you'd have a long Triceratops nose horn, and it would get resorbed, and you would see kind of the pits developing, resorbing that horn, and the adult, and then as you resorb it, made it shorter, it'd be really rugose and pitted at the end.
Mm.
And you don't get that in Torosaurus. There's no evidence that's resorbing the horn. So I don't think it was resorbing the horn. I think it started out short, stayed short, and Triceratops got long in some species and stayed long. And that's what the fossils say. I mean, it's science, so you can always be proven wrong. The nature of scientific truth is that it's contingent. Uh, Nothing is ever proven 100%.
Yeah.
You could get a fossil tomorrow that overturns everything. Um,
Well,
but so far we haven't, and we've sampled a lot, we've dug up a lot. Now, I mean, if we find those fossils, I'll say I was wrong. I mean,
yeah.
that's the thing is you have to be willing to say I'm willing to be proven I'm wrong given this data. And if you can't do that, you're not doing science. And so that's kind of what we focused on in the debate is what would it take to prove me wrong? Uh, and I laid out what I thought we needed to do, and I feel like at this point we don't have that. And what I'm really looking for is transitional fossils, things that bridge the two species. If we have those, I'm willing to concede, okay, one could turn into the other, and so far we don't.
Okay, so let's end this section, and in our next segment, I want to talk more about, say, the role of public intellectualism in general, and maybe a lot of the scientism that abounds on the internet, not only in paleontology but in science in general, and then also talk a little bit about, you know, some of the more uh, mass appeal theories that have gone on in dinosaur uh,
Yeah.
circles for the last 20 or 30 years. So we'll do that in a minute. All right, Nick, why don't we start out actually talking about the dinosaurs, and then we'll work our way sort of towards the idea of public intellectualism. I know when I was born in 1965, and when I was growing up, dinosaurs were like the old night paintings. You know, you'd see Brontosaurus in a swamp with his neck sticking out. You'd see Brachiosaurus underneath a lake with like he had a blowhole
Yeah.
on top. And but then came the 80s, and came people like Horner and Bach, and you had ideas about. I remember seeing Diplodocus with a trunk. There was ideas about if the KT meteor hadn't hit, that certain dinosaurs may have developed intelligence. What is the current state of some of these sort of more, I don't know if I'd say far out, but these sort of more speculative things? Is there any evidence of dinosaurs with lips, for example?
Uh, no evidence for lips as far as I know, although I think there's some decent evidence for cheeks in some dinosaurs. No evidence for trunks. Last no super intelligent dinosaurs. It's difficult to rule out that possibility. Um, but it's easy to kind of point, some of these ideas, it's easy to kind of point out some of the ideas that we now regard as a little more kind of speculative and out there.
Hmm.
But I mean, there's also at the same time, there's a lot of really, kind of innovative ideas people were throwing out there that, have been proven correct. And, I think a lot of people, guys like Bacher and Greg Paul were drawing feathers on dinosaurs. And
Yeah.
everybody's like, oh, that's, really speculative. And like, lo and behold, we've got them. And, Greg Paul was drawing great big giant wing feathers on his dromaeosaurs. And well, now we have winged dromaeosaurs. So I think, I think a lot of there is this attitude that like I kind of remember sort of a bit of I think there were some excesses maybe, but there was also like there's this attitude that like, oh, serious scientists, we don't speculate, we only deal with facts. And it's like, well, how do you come up with new hypotheses if you don't speculate?
Yeah.
And it's like okay, well, there's this idea that you don't want to speculate and then be proven wrong, but how do you ever be proven right about anything interesting if you're never willing to be wrong and put yourself out there a bit and throw out an idea? And uh I think, and I mean, it's really kind of a tragedy that Dale Russell is so closely associated with the dinosaur raid, which I think was just kind of a moment of fun for him. His real contributions, he was one of the first people to point out and say, look, if you look at the fossil record, the extinctions of the end of Cretaceous are very rapid. They're extraordinarily severe. They're worldwide. They're on land and at sea. He says, I think there's a catastrophe happening here. He was one of the first people to really seriously talk about the extinction of the dinosaurs and other animals as being a mass extinction driven by catastrophe. And so, that same creative mind that was willing to consider something at that point that was completely inconceivable also came up with something we maybe think of as a little bit silly, like hyper intelligent dinosaurs. Uh, but it's kind of, I think yeah, you have to come up with some,
Yeah.
new, progress means thinking of new ideas. It means thinking of things that people haven't thought of before, and that means thinking a bit out, thinking in a bit of a different way. And so I think speculation is good and it's healthy. I think the problem is where you come up with a neat speculation, you start saying, well, I have this neat idea, and it's just true because you have to test these ideas. But
Yeah.
I think the speculation is an important part of it.
I know the one I mentioned Charles Arnott as sort of an avatar of the old way of thinking, but he did have one painting that was quite famous, the Laelaps painting, where you had two
Yeah. Cool.
Laelaps dinosaurs sort of active and trying to rip each other apart. So, getting back to feathers, though, is it then now pretty accepted that feathers developed on dinosaurs as insulation, and then they were ancillarily used when as dinosaurs, developed more bird-like features?
That's what the evidence suggests now. Is we're not sure where in dinosaurs they evolved exactly. They either evolved a long time ago in the earliest dinosaurs, and then were lost in some groups,
Uh-huh.
or they may have evolved independently as many as two or three times. I mean, so we have feathers in or hair-like structures in pterosaurs, heterodontosaurs, which are small herbivorous dinosaurs. We have them in there's a thing called Calindrodromius, a small ornithopod that apparently has them. Some bristle-like things in Ptachosaur, and then pretty much all the Coelurosaurs and maybe even Tetnure and theropods all seem to have had some sort of hair-like or feather-like structures. So they may have evolved three or four times independently in archosaurs, or they may have been present
Yeah.
and then lost. And then in certain groups, they appear to have elaborated these feathers to create airfoils, and so they basically have this integumentary structure that they start using as a wing.
And just so people know, an archosaur describes not only dinosaurs but the reptiles in the sea and pterosaurs as well, right?
Archosaurs would be the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, crocodilians, and a
Yeah.
variety of their extinct relatives. Yes.
Yeah, and you mentioned hair-like structures. I was going to ask. Now, I believe it's therapsids that were the ancestors of mammals.
Yeah.
Is there something different in the skin structure of therapsids versus early dinosaurs that may have made therapsids more likely to have hair-like structures and develop fur, and whereas dinosaurs, I know we're going back to the Triassic, and there's probably not that many good skin
Yeah.
collections or whatnot. But is there something that maybe why dinosaurs seem to have developed feathers versus hair, or are there going to be dinosaurs that are discovered with fur? Do you think?
Well, it does seem like the things like, say, the Tianyu little heterodontosaur, and it's small. I saw the fossils recently, and they're about the size of a rat. It's a really tiny herbivorous dinosaur, and it has these structures. They're just long fibers. They might be hollow inside, but they're very, very simple. And you would call these things fur, probably. At least functionally, it's a fur. It's not really a
Mhm.
feather. And and it may or may not be related to the structures that eventually give rise to feathers, or it may just be an elaborate scale that it's invented for insulation. It's unclear what's going on in some of the other things. Things like Sinosauropteryx, it may have either had single bristles, like basically fur-like structures, or they may have been structures that branched at the base to create multiple kind of bristles at the ends. And we're not 100% sure, but I mean, birds have something that's vastly more complicated than anything mammals have ever produced. Their fur. They have these extraordinary, elaborate, branching structures that they can use as airfoils, as insulation, as streamlining to line their nests. They're very, very elaborate, and this would tend to imply there's something, different about you have these, developmental genes that allow you to express and express feathers and develop different structures. And maybe the genetic architecture underpinning feathers is more complex than that of same mammals, that basically allows them to build more complex tools. Their genetic tool gets more sophisticated, and they can make fancier things with it. It seems plausible. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but that would be my guess, is that they may have been predisposed to evolve complicated things in a way mammals never could.
Let me give two more questions before we get on to public intellectualism. We've mentioned Gregory Paulus a few times, and for those who don't know, he's one of the premier illustrators of dinosaurs of the last few decades. And I had read an article, it might have been online in Discover or Scientific American or something, or some science magazine, that someone was proposing that uh, our whole idea of what dinosaurs look like could be wrong, because they took what if we didn't know, for example, what a sloth looked like from its skeleton, and how could fancifully could a sloth or a grizzly bear or a seal be interpreted other than what we actually see. And I was wondering, do you think our view of, say, a stegosaurus, because at various times the plates of a stegosaur have been upright, they've been staggered,
Yeah.
they've sometimes been laid down on the side. Uh, do you think that we might only be 50% right of the way we might view things? Not only because of hair-like structures or sexual displays, but I mean, let's see if we could. Uh, uh, if we ever found in amber, say, a T-Rex blood and could learn how to clone it, we'd come up with a creature and say, "What the hell is that? That's not what we saw in Jurassic Park." You know?
I mean, I guess like kind of yes and no. If you have animals that we have reasonably close relatives of, like say a saber-toothed cat,
Uh-huh.
you've got living saber-toothed cat. We've got living cats we can look at for comparison. I mean, it might be different in its fur or coloration or something like that, but it's probably not going to look radically different than a lion or a tiger. Uh, as we start dealing with things that are more and more distantly related to anything living, it becomes harder and harder.
Yeah.
And we have with dinosaurs, we have birds to work with as living dinosaurs, and I think they provide us a lot of information. But you know, a T Rex is pretty distantly related. It's not like a saber toothed cat versus a tiger kind of a thing. It's something much more distantly related, and it's a lot harder to make accurate guesses when the living relatives are distant. We have crocodiles as well. I mean, in some cases, we have been surprised. Definitely. I mean, the if you look at the fossils coming out of the G-hole biota in China, there have been things there that if you'd proposed these animals 20 years ago, people would have laughed at you. They would have, said, you can't, this isn't serious science. These things can't exist. You're just indulging in complete fantasy if you'd tried to tell somebody that, hey, I think something like this might have existed. And examples would include things like Tianyuong, this little heterodinosaur that, it just looks this little rat-sized herbivorous dinosaur with just this long, bristly fuzz all over it, or more like bristles than fuzz. I mean, it's a weird, ugly little animal, and I don't think anyone would have believed it if you told them that it had these filaments, this fur or feathers or whatever they are, until we had the feather. Another example of this is Microraptor, and it's a dromaeosaur, a raptor, and it's got wings, and that seems remarkable enough. But it's got four of them. It's got wings on the forelimbs and wings on the hind limb, and this is just outside, I think, what anyone would have considered. If you, as an artist, had drawn this thing, people would have said, "Well, that's just like going beyond what's acceptable, and this isn't respectable paleo art to draw something like this." But it clearly existed. So, I mean, certainly in some cases, yeah, this has happened.
Yeah.
It's. I think some of the things, it may well be that some animals, maybe you'd go back and see a Triceratops and say, "Yeah, that's about what I thought Triceratops looks like." And I guess in a fairly high number of cases, it's like that. But then there's things like Microraptor, and that if we'd only had the bones, not the feathers, you never would have guessed what was going on. And I think there's a lot of, not just dinosaurs, but a lot of fossil animals that would really surprise the heck out of us. We would go with what we have until we get better information.
Now, people, when they think of dinosaurs and death, they always think of the KT extinction. But
Yeah,
I was recently reading about proliferation of mites and ticks in our current world, and I was just
yeah.
wondering, what do we know about? Uh, have there been instances found of parasitism in dinosaurs? Do we know, for example, if there were equivalents of, say, tuberculosis that might have been a plague that might have killed off some dinosaurs in a certain area? Do we have any idea about that a Diplodocus lived 250 years, a T-Rex averaged
Yeah.
30 years?
Yeah.
What if you were like an actuary at a dinosaur, insurance company? Can
Yeah.
you tell us something about those kinds of things?
I mean, the one thing I think we can be pretty certain of is that with parasitism, there would have been a lot of it. I mean, life is nothing if not efficient. It finds ways to make a living, and it's a lot more easy to just, kind of get a free ride and, consume the resources of some other organism than get them yourself. So, blood sucking and parasitism and, worms and mites and diseases. I mean, dinosaurs probably suffered from all types of diseases. Uh, what those diseases were, I mean, it's kind of hard to say. We do sometimes see evidence of injuries, infections. One of my colleagues, he'd found evidence for infection on pachycephalosaur domes. It's pretty common. It seems like they butt heads and kind of injure each other. It gets infected and probably kills the animal a lot of times. Ceratopsians have a lot of infected injuries. So definitely a lot of infection. another one of my colleagues, Wang Diying, he's found and documented these giant primitive fleas that lived in the Mesozoic, and they can't jump. They're very large crawling fleas, and they're preying on something pretty big. There's no other big animals around there except the dinosaurs back in the day. So they're like dinosaur fleas.
Yeah.
Uh, and I mean, parasitism is a constant. Lots of different groups do it today. They've been doing it for a very long time. They're very good at it. It's a good way of making a living today. I'm sure it was a great way of making a living back then. Uh, but we don't have a lot of evidence of it.
Well, let's talk about evidence. I'll segue into the idea of public intellectualism. Now,
Yeah,
online, do you ever look online and see? Because I know there are a lot of popular science bloggers.
yeah.
Are there some like science blogs that, whether it's on paleontology or other fields, do you look and just sort of like shake your head and some of these people might even be, at in academia.
Oh,
Do you think that there's a lot of scientism and a lot of misinformation out there that if you were, say, an 8 or 10 year old kid today, just that you would be lost? Or
I don't know, man. I mean, there is some good science journalism out there. There's some science journalism that's kind of a little more so. I mean, I kind of feel like the caliber of science journalism was better, like, 20 years ago when I was, or so when I was in high school. But I mean, maybe, I don't know, you always think things were better back when you were young. So it's like, maybe that's all it is.
uh,
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's kind of hard to, I guess as a scientist, you kind of always nitpick little details and anything that isn't absolutely right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to be fair, most of the people who've reported on my work, I think, have done a pretty good job. I think they've tried to get it right, and I think they've asked good questions and tried to tell a good story while getting the facts right. And so I think actually, I mean, occasionally you see something that kind of makes you roll your eyes, but I guess actually, if you ask me based on my experience with the journalists these days, I guess I think they're probably doing as good a job as anyone has ever reporting science.
Now, let's just talk about public intellectualism as a whole. And I had mentioned earlier how if you just go on Google and try type in science debate, you'll get
Yeah,
10,000. The Christopher Hitchens destroys a religious person. This
yeah,
person, Richard Dawkins, this, and that seems to be the only thing science. Whereas I don't even recall now how I stumbled upon your Torosaurus and Triceratops
yeah.
debate, but is well, number one, is there any like websites or any venues online that actually do have a fairly rigorous science, not so that you're doing science speak, but so that the average person can actually learn something scientifically, and that there's a debate
Yeah,
about the science, not Venus was spewed out of Jupiter,
yeah.
700 years ago or something.
I know what you're saying,
Yeah,
and I think there's like, and sometimes I run into issues where even within science, you're arguing with somebody, and I'm like, yeah, this isn't a real debate. I mean, a debate is when you have two prop. I see a debate, a scientific debate, is when there's two propositions
yeah,
that are both reasonable and supported by some evidence, and in a lot of cases, you have two people shouting at each other, and one side has all the evidence, and the other side won't concede that the other side has all the evidence, and it's like I don't know, it's an argument or it's a shouting match or whatever, but it's not a debate really. And there is a lot of this in the public sphere, things about, people, creationism versus evolution, or, religion versus atheism, or, global climate change versus global climate change denial. I mean, these aren't
yeah,
really debates in the sense like, I mean, with climate change, one side basically has all the facts, and the other side says, I'm not going to listen to your facts. And that's
yeah.
not really a debate in my mind. It's not a legitimate intellectual exercise. And it kind of cheapens what real debate is, I think. And I mean, you can have a debate about climate change. How much will the temperature go up? What are the various factors contributing to it in addition to humans? I mean, there is room for legitimate debate, but saying, is it happening or not, or are we contributing or not, is not really, we've kind of settled that.
Yeah, it's like when I watch one of these, if I click on some of these, it's like the thing I think to myself is Richard Dawkins, and I'll use him as an example. He came up
Yeah,
with two really great things.
yeah,
One, and they were both metaphors. The idea
Yeah,
of the selfish gene, whether you believe it or
yeah,
not,
yeah,
is a great metaphor. And then the actual metaphor of a meme. And
yeah,
I'm thinking to myself, and so what has he done? I mean, yeah, he may have done some
yeah,
little work, field work in his area, but it's like the last 20 years, it's just arguing about Jesus and God. And it's like, put your mind to work on something. I
well,
mean, of real depth. It's like I can say Baca. Well, Baca is a priest, or not a priest. He's a reverend, and
yeah,
yet he doesn't do that. I mean, he would
yeah,
seem to be much more interesting person to speak to about the scientific chasm with religion. It just seems to
yeah,
me that a lot of scientists, it says you're not going to change these people's opinions. Like I said,
yeah.
it's not a real debate, and
But
it's like do something productive.
yeah,
I
but
don't know.
part of the issue, part of the issue is I actually get really frustrated with a lot of these guys who, the kind of, sort of militant atheism or what I would call fundamentalist atheists.
Uh-huh.
And if you want to criticize religion, there's no shortage of grounds, either current events or things that happened in the past few thousand years, crusades or witch burnings or whatever you want to point, wherever you want to point the finger. Okay, sure. But I think there's been some good things that have come out of religion. I think a lot of our values, tolerating the unaccepted, that comes straight out of the New Testament. Being kind to the poor, and the modern welfare state is based on a lot of Jesus' ideals. So I think we've religion has inspired some really awful things. I think it's also inspired sometimes our better angels, in addition to our demons. And to deny that and say, no matter what evidence you present me with, I will maintain that religion is bad, and no evidence you present me with will ever make me think otherwise. That's kind of the thought process of like a creationist, if you ask me. If you want to have a legitimate debate, how does religion influence society? Where is it good? Where is it bad? I mean, I think that's worth having. But just saying all religion is bad and it's never done anything good, and I'll believe that no matter what evidence you give me, it's basically turning atheism into a faith. And you're not tolerating dissent. You're not you're being intolerant and very yeah, you're being intolerant of other people's viewpoints, and you're unwilling to consider other people's viewpoints or question your own. And it's basically making atheism into a religion.
Well,
So
let's end up this segment. I'll have one final question, and then we'll wrap up the interview to talk about your future plans and whatnot. But
yeah,
in that vein, let's say, because I guess you're in your late 30s, by the end of your career, say 20, 30, 40 years from now, whenever it might be, if there
yeah.
was like one or two questions about dinosaurs or anything in paleontology that you would love to see solved by the time you're on your deathbed, what would those one or two things be?
Oh man, that's a really tough one. Uh, I guess I'd like to know more about the end Cretaceous mass extinction, although not necessarily dinosaurs, because
Uh-huh.
we basically know almost all of them went out at the boundary except for birds. But what's happening to everything else in the fauna? I think we really need to know more about some of these other mass extinction events. There may be events going on at the Eocene, Oligocene, Cenomanian, Turonian, maybe Jurassic, Cretaceous, definitely Triassic, Jurassic, Permo, Triassic. These are huge events that are shaping the evolution of biodiversity, and we need to understand them. Evolution of flight, I think it was probably a lot more complicated than we think. And I'd like to what's up with dromaeosaurs? I would really like to figure that one out. How do they fit into flight evolution? I think those are the two ones I'm really interested in right now.
Okay, well, we'll end this segment, and when we get back, we'll end the interview talking with Nick Longrich. And I would like to end this interview with Nick with asking about his future plans. But before I do, can you just give anyone listening or watching this an idea of sort of a day in the life? Do you come in at 9 o'clock? You have a student that brings you. We found this great discovery in Bulgaria. You got to take a look at this. What they found. I mean, what is a day like?
I mean, it's really variable. I mean, some of it's probably pretty boring and prosaic. It's like, okay, fill out this form, grade these papers, deliver this lecture. The lectures can be fun. Sometimes it's like meetings with graduate students. I was just kind of you know it's not all like, running around in the desert digging up dinosaurs all the time, research careers. But then there's some really fun stuff too. I mean, being out at the pub with a colleague and he says, we have this amazing discovery, but the paper got rejected. And I stop and I'm thinking like, I don't, what you're telling me sounds too fantastic to be true, but if it's true, I really want to know more about it. And following up on that and getting, having an amazing research project emerge out of that. Uh, Dealing with that paper then being rejected and trying to figure out what we're going to do next. Trying to figure out how to get labs set up. I don't know what was yesterday. I was preparing the bone of a pteranodon in my lab. Uh, so it's a varied thing. I mean, it's kind of anything you want it to be in a way. You walk in every day and you're sort of your own boss, and you can work on anything. You can work on the end Cretaceous mass extinction. You can work on lizard phylogeny. You can work on preparing fossils. You can work on writing a review article. It's wonderful and it's a bit terrifying as well. It's something. It's a great freedom, but it's tricky trying to figure out what to do with your time and how to best use it. And what do you want to accomplish, and how do you make sure that every day you're getting a little closer to that, and in doing stuff that you'll be at the end of your career you'll be able to look back and feel glad that you did the things you did. It's
Well, I had asked you about questions you wanted answered on a more personal
Yeah.
level. 20 or so years from now, where do you want to be in your field? I mean, have you published any books? Or do you have ideas for books coming out?
I don't know. I mean, I've kind of had writer's block the past few years. If that
Uh,
went away, it'd be kind of fun to write a book. It would be. I mean, I kind of feel like I really got into this field because of books people have written, things like Greg Paul's book and Bob Bakker's book and Jared Diamond's stuff and Stephen Jay Gould's stuff and Darwin's stuff. So I think writing's a really important part of that. And I feel like if I was a better writer, I'd like to do that. Sure. Uh, I don't know. I mean, I kind of like, a lot of people I think worry about, what do their colleagues think about them. And I kind of feel like, I want to feel like I've done work that I'm proud of. I don't, I mean, I don't want to say I don't give a damn what my colleagues think, but I don't think you should be doing things because you think that your colleagues will like what you're doing or not. You should think that it's important because you want to do it. And like, it's like, trying to be a moral person because you worry about what other people are going to think if you do something wrong. I mean, you should
yeah,
do the right thing because you care about it. And
yeah,
the same reason, like I want to do science that's, not because it's going to get me a lot of funding, not because it's going to get me publicity or you know, awards or whatever the heck, which it probably wouldn't anyway. But like, because it's stuff I genuinely think is important and is interesting, and that's it's a hard job. It's a you got to do stuff that'll keep you going. And what keeps me going is making new discoveries and finding out things I didn't know, and kind of doing research and sort of creating something in a way. I mean, it's not really creating a new species when you describe a new species, but it feels like it's creating something.
yeah.
So
So let me give you just a minute or two to give you some closing remarks on whatever you wanted to say about either paleontology or whatnot.
boy, that's too open ended. I'm trying to think of where
Oh.
to go with that. Any suggestions?
Oh, okay. Well, it's been a pleasure to interview. You're very forthright, and I think a lot of people will enjoy the interview. So let me just thank you again for taking this hour or so to speak with me. I did enjoy your debates, and hopefully we'll see some more real debates involving you and other people in the sciences. And for those people who enjoyed this interview with Nick Longrich, in 2 weeks, my next interview will be with a panel of three people talking about the films of John Cassavetes. So we go from dinosaurs to filmmaking and backwards and forwards. And so, again, Nick Longrich, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you again. It's been a
Okay.
pleasure.